Hola, hola, everyone that's joining us online. We are now doing our next podcast episode, Data Privacy, Safeguarding the Future of Innovation. Today we have two wonderful ladies that are joining up on stage, Michael Best partner, Elizabeth Rogers, and Ashley Fischer. So I'll pass it on over to them.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thank you so much for attending. This podcast today will relate to data privacy and safeguarding innovation. And a little bit about my background. I've been practicing at Michael Best for 6 years tomorrow. I am a partner in the Data Privacy and Cybersecurity Group, and I started my career about 11 years ago following a massive data breach in the state of Texas. So worked very hard to help companies to protect their data, to build a privacy program brick by brick, and to minimize risk of data breaches. Today, we're going to focus on that innovation that drives success in whatever size company, but we're not going to boil the ocean. We have an hour, and I'm so fortunate to have an expert next to me who will help us talk about tools and practices that will safeguard that innovation. I'm going to turn it over to Ashley so Ashley can introduce her background and how she became the expert that she is today. Ashley?
Thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Ashley Fischer. I'm the General Counsel for TIFF's Treats. And first things first, a disclaimer that I'm here on behalf of myself and I'm not here on behalf of TIFF's Treats. So my background here, at TIFF's Treats, I do handle all things legal, and that includes our privacy compliance program. We are a cookie delivery company, but we're largely an e-commerce company. So a lot of our business comes through online portal with consumers, individuals, as well as businesses coming through the portal of the website, of our app. And then prior to that, I worked at HEB on their digital side, supporting the product team, working on their app, working on their website. And then, as a side gig, sometimes I help and do some pro bono work for startup companies. And so largely the work is focused on consumer goods and services separately, so I help them build foundation, right? So we're not talking about companies who have all the nice to haves. We're talking about companies who are building foundational infrastructure.
So Ashley not only has a side hustle helping the startups, she has twins that are in second grade, and she coaches basketball and other sports for them. And so I have no idea when she sleeps, but when she is awake and when she is at work, she is focusing on, among other serious legal issues, safeguarding data privacy. So in the context of innovation, Ashley, can we talk a little bit about how important data is to innovation?
Data is so critical to innovation because you need those data points to help you grow your business, right? You need to know what people want and where they want it, when they want it, how they want it, so you can deliver that, because that's how you make your business successful. And so what does that mean granularly, right? So it could be a geographical area. Like maybe some people in this zip code have a preference for a certain kind of food product or a certain type of day. Maybe it's a college area, and you know that because of your data that you've ingested, you know that they prefer to purchase their cookie products at night, right? And so how does that translate to your business? Knowing that can help your business stay open later and get more of those consumer goods in. So data analytics are critical to innovation because it can help fuel where your business goes, your hours, your products, what you have available, so that you can get it to the consumer and what they need and grow your business.
Exactly. So we're looking at the growth of a business based on the data and the queries that you can run against that data. And there's certain layers of protection that need to go around that data. How significant is that for a business starting up or wanting to grow for startups? Like, who are the audiences that you need to assure and be reliable about your data, innovation, and protection?
you have a few audiences that you're speaking to. One is your consumer, I think, is your first and foremost, because that's where your bread comes from, right? But then you have the layered in of you just need to know the laws because you have regulators out there. And so I think it's critical, back to your original prompt of this is like the heart and soul of your company is compliance and your trust with your consumers. And so knowing what the law is impactful so that you can build around it, but also you need to build that trust with your consumer. And so it's not just from a legal perspective, it's a trust perspective, especially if you're building your business, you're introducing it. You need them to know what it is, be transparent, and trust you with their business. And so it's very critical to understand what those laws are so that you can implement a privacy practice to build that trust.
Correct. So you have the social contract with your consumers that we got your back. We not only have your cookies, we got your back. We're going to protect your data. And one more critical audience is the audience of the regulators. So how do you, as a startup, prepare for that, getting ready for the lens of the regulators, if you will?
So there are things you really do need to invest in, and that's good counsel. Good outside counsel. I do have good counsel here in Elizabeth. She is, full disclaimer, our Tiff Street's privacy counsel. And she's very helpful in helping us be practical and build that trust with our consumer and with the regulator. And so I value that in her. But spending some money on the front end for good counsel to help you understand the law can save you money. It's obvious in one way where you are compliant with the law, and so later on you don't face consequences of not being compliant, so that's the obvious way, right? But then the other way that's not as obvious is sometimes, especially smaller companies, think they need to do too much because they don't get good counsel, they don't invest that money, and so they end up building in too many things that are not applicable to them. And I can give you like an easy example. I've seen on some privacy policies that they maybe didn't seek the right counsel or maybe try to do on their own, and they include terms for like GDPR, and they do no business in the European Union. And so that is confusing to the consumer. Again, you're that trust building, right? But it's also not applicable. And so it doesn't make sense to have it in the contract or in your privacy policy. And so you are wasting time. Right? And so that's another way where it's just not as efficient to do it on your own, and you really need on that front end to understand the landscape of the laws that are actually applicable to you. A lot of these privacy laws have thresholds for businesses, so you may not even need to go above and beyond. That's being practical, right? That's where a good outside counsel can help you. Especially California comes to mind. They have thresholds that are for applicability for companies. Smaller companies and companies that don't handle a lot of data, or individual data of consumers, don't have to comply, right? And so making sure you understand what your company actually needs to comply with is critical. And so I'd say on the front end, you really need to get good advice from counsel. And I'm not just talking about finding like your friend who does criminal law, but just like, hey, can you help me out, which often happens in startup. I think it's sort of like the brain and the heart, right? Like maybe the brain is like your funding and all of that, but your heart is compliance. Like you just really need to spend some money. It's a critical organ. You need to spend some money on that compliance front.
So in your past and your career in advising, both at HEB and here at Tiff Streets, what would you say are some of the key components of building a privacy compliance programs that would be relevant to an innovator?
So what I would say is start out with the must-haves, right? So what is must-have? What is nice to have? Start out with the must-have. You need a way to communicate to your consumer Assuming you have you need to understand who your consumer is too, right? What you're doing with their data and how you're using it and for what purpose and where it is and how can you do that, right? Well, the tool used for that is usually a privacy policy. You have it posted on your website, and then you have terms of service that are also posted on your website that usually encompass rules for how to engage in your product. And those are some of the things that you can start out with.
Right. How important is it for you to be connected to the other members of your team when you're in the process of building this privacy compliance program?
So I think critical, right? Especially at this phase when you're coming in and you're building something. And I would say this is probably where startups have a advantage because you can build it in correctly the first time if you're starting it up, right? Sometimes going back when the plane is already in flight and all of these privacy laws are in place and you're going back to like retool everything, retool how the engine works is harder than it is to just build it right the first time. And so I would say maybe some of these startups don't have a lot of advantages from that front, but this front, like, you can build it right. And so how do you do that if your whole team, if one person's just working on privacy or two people and not the whole team as they're building out functionality, we're going to be missing it across the enterprise, right? And so critical to educate your team and bring them along on your privacy journey when you get that good outside counsel help to help you build it correctly from the start so that you have the same understanding of your privacy outlook, what you're using the data for your analytics. I'll try to bring it home more specifically. If your engineering team is building out data analytics and your marketing team is doing something different with it, that's a problem, right? That's a problem. Now you have maybe something on your privacy policy saying you don't use folks' information in a certain geographical way, or like maybe their email address a certain way, but marketing team is doing it. That's a disconnect. Now you face losing trust with your customer because on your privacy policy it says you're handling something one way, but in reality, one rogue team who didn't get brought in and wasn't educated on the training is now doing something different with that data that you're not being transparent with. So it's really important that you educate your whole team and you're all aligned on actually how you're using data.
All right, so a lot of times in-house counsel or even outside counsel earn the term Dr. No in the face of innovation. The sales team wants to try something different. The DevOps people want to start something different. And there you are, you're sitting in the middle of a compliance program and people are sending texts without you knowing. They're marketing products that you don't even know about yet. So how do you establish credibility and get everybody on board for the program? What are some of your checklist items that you like to do?
FaceTime. That's what I like to do, but I'm also the lawyer in the house, right? And so sometimes people are like, oh man, the lawyer here, what are you doing? And so I don't want to stop business. I work here too, usually is what I say I lead to with. Like, I would like us to make the sale. I would like us to get out there to customers, but my job is to make sure we're doing good business and I'm getting rid of the bad business, right? And so again, that goes back to communication with teams and meeting with each group, understanding what they're doing, and helping them to achieve their goals, because that's my job, is to help them achieve their business goal. Whether it is like, hey, we want to do an analytics and see like what type of anniversary or celebration people usually focus on or purchase in this area, right? So that we can market to them. Now we can make a content that markets to that, right? Making sure we're doing that in a good way. And I'd say I always have the focus of it's not just law. There's like the creep factor. Like, you don't want to ruin trust with your customers. You don't want to be too invasive where it's creepy.
That's one focus, is the consumer, the primary focus. And then again, as you start to develop and establish policies and structure around all these practices of the different teams, how do you speak their language? What are some of your ideas and takeaways for people watching about how to get their buy-in. Let's say you get a policy that's 13 pages and has citations. How do you make it work for the team?
Make it more digestible. So training is a lot of it. So often we get these guidelines. It's a lot of law that comes in. They need to know it. So my job is to make sure, how is it actually going to be impactful? How is it operationalized, right? Because I need to them not just to be like, okay, here's a law. I need them to put it into practice, compliance in practice. And so what I do is try to implement it along with what I know they're doing. And so I'll give you an easy example of canned spam laws, which is email, right? And so that's around data privacy. You need to make sure you get comply with opting out list. And so going in, and also I should go back one more, marketing versus transactional, right? You need to make sure you understand if it's marketing or transactional, and then comply with the opt-out list. And so what I did was like create a guideline that literally takes an example of our marketing emails, and I'm like, here's one for marketing. I took an example of one we use for transactional use. Here's one from transactional, and then anything in the gray area. And I tried to like help guide them on how to use that in simple terms, and then not like overly complicated, but with like real examples.
Exactly. So along with privacy, to have a program that protects your data that you're using for innovation, how are you dealing with, and what are your suggestions for protecting the cybersecurity hygiene so that innovation can go forward without all these giant risks? What are your takeaways for creating a cybersecurity compliance program?
A few basic things. I think an easy thing for startups to do is, one, own all of their patents and own all of their works they create, right? And so that's an easy way to start out foundationally. But also, you need to have some sort of cybersecurity awareness, and maybe it is no one in-house. Sometimes folks, it's okay. There are companies out there that have a cybersecurity focus for small businesses and startups that can really help you, and they are bargains, so they won't give you more than you need, but you do need something in place, and they can help you run analytics on where your gaps are in your coverage. If you're taking credit cards, you really do need that. Some coverage, and you may be able to contract that with some vendors who they take all of the data and it never comes across on your own servers. But you need to have an awareness of it and know your limitations. If you don't know enough, that means you need to go get someone in the room, an expert in the room.
Excellent. So then you have all this data, there's consumer data, you're doing business now outside of Texas, congratulations, in all these different states. You have some intellectual property. What are some of the practices and tools that you are aware of that you use to safeguard that data in storage and in transmission?
That's a great question. I think you have to start off by knowing where your data is, right? I mean, it's just fundamental. And it sounds so simple, like, what do you mean where my data is? Well, it's on the computer, right? But it's not just like on your computer, but it could be just on your computer. But doing that, there are software out there that helps you data map, right? Do a data list of inventory. It helps you organize for it yourself, for your company. So knowing what vendors use your data, knowing how you use your data, knowing what data you have, it's interesting. It never fails to surprise me. Like when I do these surveys at every company, finding like each department and giving them a list of data do you have, and it always is surprising. Like one random department has like account information, and you would never, like the real estate department. And you're like, why do you need that, right? You don't need that. And so help cleaning that up, and just by doing regular audits of it. And I've done it very crudely on an Excel sheet, where it's not my favorite option, but it's when you need to do it, you need the data. You do it on an Excel sheet, saying you go to each department, find where they have the data, how are they using the data, where it is, and then you start there, and then Now I have software that does it for me. It maps it out more beautifully and gives me a lot more granular data. But just starting out with finding out what you have and how you're using it is critical to doing anything else.
That's an excellent segue to the timeline, because we're talking about businesses that may be dependent completely on investors versus sales at the front. So when you are small and you don't have the budget that you have now, what are some just little basic steps to achieve the principles of data minimization and access control when you're on a budget?
Good question. So start out, again, this is your advantage of like you're building your startup. You can start out doing it the right way. Don't take on as much data. If you don't need it, don't take it. Don't take it in. So that's an easy thing to do, right? And if you do take information in, say you need an order form with their name and someone's address, delete it later. Have regular intervals of deletion if you don't use it again. Just basic clean data hygiene of keeping what you do have. You know what it is and you can get rid of it on a regular interval, but also if you can avoid taking it in the first place, don't take it. The other thing, access controls, right? Maybe you do need that information. Maybe you need their phone number and their address and their name just to do your core business. Does everyone need to see it? No. So the access control part is where you can help. Maybe the finance team needs that information, but your real estate team doesn't, right? And
Right.
So putting in those basic access controls. And then I'll say one more thing about contracting for small companies. When you start contracting out your data, that is somewhere you can get in trouble, because it's worthwhile on those business critical agreements to have an attorney look at it. And I'll tell you, some of them that I've seen that have come to me, they're like, hey, we're getting a really good bargain on this company that will help us process our customer data, and they're like in a foreign country. And so how are you ever going to even enforce that agreement? Just on a practical front, right? When the laws are like Kazakhstan or something like that. But they get a really good deal, and that's what they focus on to me in the front end. I'm like, I understand, but lawsuits are long and slow and expensive, and regulators come in and they are expensive too. So your good deal is just out the window. And so I would say invest also in knowing where your data is and making sure that an attorney is looking at that contract where, if you're talking about storing data.
I want to back up and really emphasize and focus on a key point you made about data minimization, because I don't want to sound contradictory. We talked about how important data is to innovation and being able to look back to that historical data and see what are the biggest holidays perhaps for your customer orders. But on the flip side, to focus on data minimization, because in all of the new state consumer data privacy laws that are going to go into effect or are in effect, data minimization is key. How do you socialize a records retention policy that has a maximum? After being with a company that's held on to things like many companies for over 20 years, how do you socialize the importance of getting rid of that data in the midst of innovation?
That's a challenge. I'll tell you, what I do is go to leadership first, right? Help them understand what my goals are and the reasoning why. And usually you get buy-in there because it's critical. Then you need to go being practical. How do you actually get it out to each department? And so each department, I try to get a records champion. And so one person to kind of hold the water for their team, because I'm not there on the team every day. And so it really cannot be me, even if I wish it was, right? Because I think sometimes the lawyers do a better job of like implementing these rules, but getting that person in that team who's on the front lines and who can remember to raise this issue. And it doesn't even be that they have to know everything. It just means they have to be aware of it so they can raise it up and bring it to the legal department, or if you're a startup, bringing it to your outside counsel.
So you've worked hard on socializing, training, creating a data map, knowing where your data lives, safeguarding your intellectual property, your customer data. what happens if a ransomware attack occurs or any other kind of distributed denial of service and shuts down all the accounts when people are trying to order cookies? How do you prevent that kind of risk of losing all of this precious data that's driving your innovation?
Yeah, I think that's a fear most companies have. I'd say if you are just thinking about it when it happens, you're too late, right? So part of a good compliance program is you already have steps in place to help with that. At a minimum, you should already have a privacy outside counsel ready to go. That way, if you can call them up, they can help you take an action plan. I think that is the first critical step. If you want to be a little bit more sophisticated, you can have a cybersecurity vendor that can help you like do forensics and come in, and you can have them on contract ready to go. A lot of them will sign up just a regular master agreement, and then you can have them on tap. Sometimes they take a retainer, but it might be worth it, especially if you have a lot of customer data, because how does this impact you later on? Well, it impacts your investors, it impacts your customers, it impacts, just the viability of your company, because if this could take your company out, essentially. Even if you recover from the fines and all the consequences, the legal consequences, you may have just lost trust with your customer. And so putting in a small retainer on the front end, it seems, when you do it in the scale of things, it's just a minor thing you can do. But having those things ready and lined up right away and knowing where your data is right away and where it lives are things you should do to prep for this. And they're basic things you can do to prep before ransomware comes in or not. And then again, on the IT side, making sure you understand your backups and all of that. And creating a position. I'd say you shouldn't decide as a company if you're going to pay a ransomware when the ransomware is happening. You should already know as a company if you're going to be deciding to pay or not before you're put under all that pressure, because when those attacks happen, they are quick. You don't have a lot of time to think. You don't have a lot of time to prepare. You don't have a lot of time to onboard outside counsel to get them familiar with your company and where your data lives and your practices. You definitely don't have a lot of time to respond. And so being prepared, I'd say beforehand, is key.
Excellent. So what are some of the resources you would recommend to a small startup versus, having a privilege of having the corporation that has information security team and cybersecurity teams? What kind of resources would you refer a small business to create either a privacy or cybersecurity compliance program? So
definitely, bare minimum, you need outside counsel, right? You just need outside counsel. There's not really a way around that. And you need good outside counsel who's competent in that area. That's also key because they'll help you also be practical. So yes, when you're in a bigger company, you have layers and layers of support. You probably have a robust cybersecurity response plan, a command team. You've probably tried these tabletop exercises and done regularly, but none of that is the luxury model, right? The bare bones is, I would say, get your outside counsel, get a plan in place, make sure your outside counsel understands where your data lives and how your privacy practices, and then I'd say secondarily, get a vendor, a response vendor for cybersecurity that does this, and have them ready to go because they're going to be critical if something happens and helping you cut the losses, stop the bleeding.
And so let's say you have this team of partners assembled, you're starting out, you want to make sure this critical customer intellectual property data is protected. What kind of assessment would you do, and what kind of resource would you hire for assessing that risk?
Depending upon, I'd say, what your startup involves and what level of data, maybe it's critical data, maybe, I think we had earlier someone who had health data, you might actually consider getting a fractional chief information security officer, just someone who has a competency in this and who can help be practical. those are folks who just like work part-time for your company but kind of manage it. You really need someone managing it, right? If you have a little bit more budget that for that, I think it's worthwhile. Outside of that, you really need to be doing audits, assessing your risk. One of the worst things you can do is ignore it and just pretend like it's not happening, right? And so, especially with regulators, they will look to that as more of you're doing this intentionally as opposed to you're trying your best and you just couldn't manage this. So auditing your risk for cybersecurity, and that will take a cybersecurity technical expert, right, to come in and look at this. And you need that. If you don't have one in-house, if you have one in-house, make sure they're doing proper things and doing from their technical side.
So we go back to that cliche, if you see something, say something. If you see something, do something. What is your action plan if you get some vulnerabilities? How do you prioritize what steps to take to safeguard all that data?
Okay, so this is a really good question. I'll tell you why. Folks get scared, the business folks are like, oh, we have something happening. We have to have a perfect response. We have to do everything perfectly. We have to, like, and then almost sometimes they get scared and paralyzed, right, from it. So like just pretending like it's not happening, or I don't want to look, it's their head in the sand, right? And so that's the worst thing you can do. So take a risk-based approach, right? So you might have to take a phased approach too, especially if you're lean on resources, which often startups are. You're lean on money, you're lean on people, and so you really need to just, again, I wish I could give you like a really specific example, but like across the board, you just need to take your biggest risk and look at it, right? Triage, and then start phasing out and trying to work on it, because what the regulator is going to look for is effort. Are you doing something? Do you have an action plan to continue to do something and fix this problem?
Exactly. So let's say I wanted to start a business in 2024. Knowing what you know after looking back and knowing what you're looking at in 2024, what should I be aware of? What am I going to be facing in this year and beyond?
That's a good, these are good, Elizabeth. A few things. One, you just have ongoing privacy laws coming in place. So I think you have the benefit of just knowing it's expected. It's expected by law. Consumers are more sophisticated on it. So building in those things and being aware of things that could be obstacles to building a good privacy compliance. So like generative AI, while it's exciting, it is, and you can implement it to make, great advantages to your business, but it also, we're already learning that it could be biased. So being aware of that, it could give false information. It just makes things up. I know in the legal world, it would just make up law, like case law that lawyers were actually submitting to courts, and the courts were figuring out the cases didn't even exist, right? It also can pose cybersecurity risk, I think. So being aware of that, and then I'd say, yeah, just making sure you're doing a proper assessment of that.
Mm-hmm. So should I just avoid AI altogether to stay in business? Or what are some of the basic things I can do to advise my consumers I'm using it?
Don't avoid AI completely. I heard someone say this, and I think it's so true, that I feel like it was the cloud. Everyone was afraid of the cloud at first, and now it's just like the backbone of everyone's business. I think that's the same thing for AI. You just have to be smart about it and cautious, right? And so you can start doing basic policies around AI. Don't use it without legal vetting or IT vetting, right? That's easy thing to do. So if you implement it, first stop is legal and IT. And then what legal will do is make sure they're looking at the contract. You're talking about privacy. Some of these, you don't know where the data is going that you're putting in there. And you may be putting in really crucial, aside from like customer data, you may be putting in critical business numbers, like how much your company is grossing, and you're a private company. As you're trying to write out, you have AI help you write out an investment deck, right? And so who owns that data now? Did you just give it away, your confidential information? And so legal will help you review that AI company's terms of service and their privacy policy to see what they are doing with the data you're going to put in and who owns it. And that is critical because you want to make sure you're not giving away data that you don't want to.
What if I'm in a hurry? I'll just worry about consent later. Like, what if I just want to get my sales in? I don't want to go through all these barriers of opting in and opting out. What risk do I face to everything that I want it all, and I don't want to worry about all this consent?
I know. That is, I feel like you're the sales team talking to me. Just in general, but in sales in general, not anybody specifically. Yeah, I want you to make that sale too, okay? But pumping the brakes a little bit, making sure you put your seatbelt on and following the speed limits is there for a reason, right? And so the same thing here. Getting consent is critical. Again, you're back to making sure your consumer is saying it's okay to use their data that way. Your reputational harm, right? Aside from just regulators who say you need consent first, right? And so making sure you're slowing down and you're doing that and you're assessing what consent is needed. And if consent's not needed, then maybe that's okay. But one of the things I'll just tie this back in a little bit back to your privacy policy and your terms of service. A lot of times I've seen in startups where they're like, okay, they get their privacy policy, they get their terms of service, and they just post it online and that's it. And they never get their consumer to agree to those terms. And so I think that's a critical second step that I wanted to highlight, that you want to make sure in some capacity you're getting the folks who are interacting with your site to agree to those terms. And that could be through the purchase and a click-through, but that's another step.
Yeah. Well, I just thought they were ordering cookies for their nephew. I didn't realize there was all this stuff that I have to worry about, but thank you for sharing that. So winding up and just focusing on really key takeaways in this critical area and growth in the information age. We went from manufacturing to information. Here we are. Not only do we have the internet, not only do we have the cloud storage to be concerned about and AI. If you had to give a startup business 3 key takeaways about how to protect and safeguard innovation, what would they be?
I'd say first, go invest in your intellectual property. Go get your logo trademarked. Go get any of your content or your technology patented, copyrighted. Go invest in that because that is going to be brand protection. That is going to protect your idea too from someone else coming and taking it. So I think that's a fundamental place to start and worth investing in. And then I would invest in making sure you get privacy counsel to help you with your privacy policy so that you can be transparent about data usage. And then terms of service and making sure that they understand the rules of how to interact with your product.
Excellent. So if there was a fourth, would you say an incident response plan or training?
Yeah, the whole compliance program, right? So the incident response plan, yes, thank you, she has the notes. Making sure you just have like a rudimentary plan, right? It doesn't have to be overly complex. Don't overthink it. Just make sure you already know what you're going to do if it happens, because in this day and age, like cybersecurity risk is real. It is, again, it's not an if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And so making sure you know what you're going to do if that happens is critical.
Excellent. Well, we have members in the audience today. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to shout out anything that you are thinking about. If you've got your own clients that are in this space or you yourself are doing it. I think we have a question from Aaron Barker.
Yeah, I had a question. So you know, privacy, obviously it's key, and it's key to get it right in the beginning, as you guys have been talking about. The hard part, of course, is that the founder, particularly if they're unfunded and they're trying to get funded, you know, they're in a hurry to get kind of the website up, get the product out there so they can show traction that will excite the VCs and help them get funded. But we also want them to take the privacy steps seriously, and you know, they go too far down the road with selling their product or building their website and they haven't addressed privacy. That's obviously a problem because it's always harder to go back and fix stuff. So what are kind of, when you sort of triage with a founder, like you've got limited resources for legal spend, what are the key privacy things they can do, day one that aren't going to necessarily break the bank, but make sure that they're not building huge issues for the future?
Well, first I would say focusing on this does give you an advantage over your competitors if you're looking for funding, because this shows how your level of sophistication, right? Like, how are you focused on compliance? Because investors are looking at this because they understand the long game, right? They understand how much it's going to cost you on the back end. And so just knowing that big picture of things, that you're going to be a leg up, even though you need to move fast and hurry and your engineer may be working on your core business and doesn't have time to do privacy implementation. But prioritizing that is key, I think, for your long-term investment. So basic things you can do are literally just knowing what data you have, where you have it, and how you use it. I mean, that is fundamental. And so doing that on a list, I said I used Excel survey list before and just had that plotted out, and then checking it again on regular intervals. Has anything changed? So it's sort of like your audit of it and your health. And then building out those privacy policies, those terms of service are very rudimentary things you can do.
I think, too, I would add to those points is that when you are using technology in the delivery of services or goods, figuring out what data is being collected and how is it being collected. Is it on the web browser? If it's an app, whether it's a mobile app or a health-related app, testing the technology with somebody who is familiar with categories of data that are protected is critical on the front end, because if those people are not being told that that data is being collected or for what purpose, then it sets them up for serious fines and penalties. So just having the awareness, making sure there's diagrams of the technology, intaking the data, where is it going, who has access to it, basic principles that really don't cost a lot, but just socializes that whole life cycle of the data is important, making a culture. And then when you can afford it, having an entire program or more documents that might help support the practices, but just getting the practices right from the start, even without paper, is a huge step. Any other questions? Oh, I think, are we good? Then we don't want to stand between you and lunch. We're going to break for lunch. Please come back and join us. Thank you so much for your attention. Have fun.